Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going way back in time to the early 1900s, to the Philippines. And it's kind of a crazy story about this lawyer named Howard D. Terrell, who got into some serious trouble with the law. The thing is, though, he wasn't actually breaking the law himself. He got in trouble for helping someone, LSE, try to get around it. It's a wild case, and we've got actual court documents and legal summaries to help us figure out exactly what went down.
What's really fascinating about this period in the Philippines is that the whole legal system was kind of in this state of transition. You had American rule coming in and transforming things, which created this really unique blend of legal traditions. And right in the middle of all this change, you have Howard D. Terrell entering the scene.
Okay, so paint us a picture here. What's the backdrop for all of this legal drama?
So we've got this club called the Centro Bellas Artes, which honestly sounds super fancy, right?
Yeah, like something out of a movie. Were they like the movers and shakers of Philippine society?
Well, the name definitely makes you think of elegance and sophistication. But the reality is, this club wasn't just about the arts. It was actually formed, at least in part, as a way to get around certain laws.
Whoa. Okay, so it was like a secret society hiding in plain sight.
You could say that, yeah. And this is where Terrell comes in. He was actually one of the people who helped create this club, knowing full well it was designed to operate in this legal gray area.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, he then becomes the club's lawyer, which the Supreme Court of the Philippines was not happy about at all.
Okay, so they were basically saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't create a club to dodge the law and then act like it's innocent legal counsel.
Exactly. They saw it as a huge conflict of interest.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What were the actual charges against Terrell? What did the court documents say?
So there were two main charges against him. The first was that he actively participated in the creation of the Centro Bellas Artes. Knowing it was intended to evade the law, it wasn't a matter of him just being there. He was deeply involved right from the beginning.
So he wasn't just a lawyer, he was like the mastermind behind it all.
Exactly. And then the second charge was that he continued to act as the club's attorney, even though he knew it was set up to break the rules. So for the court, this wasn't just a small mistake. It showed a total disregard for legal and ethical boundaries.
Wow, so he was really pushing the limits there. What was Terrell's defense? Did he try to deny everything?
Nope, not at all. He completely denied any wrongdoing. He even brought in people to vouch for him, character witnesses, hoping to convince the court he was a good guy.
So he was fighting hard to save his reputation.
Absolutely. But the court had evidence, hard evidence. And get this, they even brought up his testimony from a previous case where he was accused of fraud, estafa, as they call it in the Philippines.
Oh, man. Talk about your past coming back to haunt you.
Right. It made it really tough for him to claim he was totally innocent in this whole Centro Bellas Artes thing.
So what was the final verdict? Did they throw the book at him?
Well, they didn't disbar him completely, which is interesting. He was suspended from practicing law for 1 year.
Only 1 year. That doesn't sound too bad.
Well, you have to remember the context. We're talking about the Philippines in the early 1900s. The legal system was still developing, finding its feet, and the Supreme Court was probably using this case to set a precedent.
So they were making an example out of him.
Exactly. They wanted to send a clear message to other lawyers about the importance of ethical conduct. And the fact that they didn't disbar him completely suggests they thought he could redeem himself, that maybe he could learn from this whole mess and come back to practicing law in an ethical way.
That's really interesting. So it wasn't just about punishing Terrell. It was about shaping the future of the legal profession in the Philippines.
Right. And that's one of the things that makes this case so relevant even today.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's dig into that. Why does this case from over a century ago still matter now?
Well, because it really gets to the heart of what we mean by gross misconduct, especially when it comes to lawyers.
Okay, gross misconduct. That sounds serious.
It is. So basically, it refers to actions that are way outside the bounds of ethical and professional behavior, so much so that they require some kind of serious disciplinary action.
So it's not just a slip-up, it's like knowingly doing something wrong.
Exactly. It's about intentionally violating the core principles of being a lawyer.
So you can't just play dumb and say, oh, I was just following my client's orders.
Nope, not at all. And Terrell's case really cemented this idea that lawyers have a special duty to uphold the law, even when their clients are trying to bend the rules.
It's kind of like a doctor taking an oath to do no harm, right? Lawyers have a similar obligation to the legal system itself.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And Terrell's case shows us that this principle has been around for a long, long time.
So it's like a cautionary tale for lawyers, or a reminder to always think about the ethical implications of their actions.
Exactly. And it's relevant for all of us, really. It reminds us that even when we think we're being clever or strategic, there are always ethical considerations to keep in mind.
Okay, I'm seeing how this case from 1903 can still spark some serious conversations today.
For sure.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, are there any other interesting details from the case that stood out to you?
Well, there's this one specific detail that I found super fascinating. The court document actually mentions the exact law Terrell was in trouble under. It was Section 21 of the Code of Civil Procedure. And the crazy thing is, this section is surprisingly easy to read, even if you're not a lawyer.
So even back then, they wanted to make sure everyone understood the rules of the game.
Yeah, it was like they were saying, look, here are the guidelines, no excuses. And what's even more interesting is that Section 21, it uses this phrase, moral turpitude, which is still used today to evaluate someone's character in legal situations.
Moral turpitude.
That sounds heavy.
It is. It basically means conduct that goes against what society considers to be honest and moral.
So being a lawyer isn't just about knowing the law, it's about being a good person, too.
Exactly. And that message is something that transcends time and legal systems. Wow, this case really packs a punch. It's amazing how a story from over a century ago can still feel so relevant today.
It really shows how the past can inform our present.
Well, we've just scratched the surface here. We've got a lot more to uncover about Terrell's case and what it can teach us about the legal profession today. Stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive.
I'll be here.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been exploring the fascinating story of Howard D. Terrell, a lawyer in the early 1900s Philippines, who got into some trouble for pushing the boundaries of the law. It makes you wonder, what was it like to be a lawyer back then? Was a one-year suspension a big deal in the early 1900s?
You know, to really grasp the impact of that suspension, we have to consider the Philippines back then. The legal profession was just starting to establish itself, really, and the Supreme Court. They were probably using Terrell's case as a way to send a strong message about how lawyers should behave. It was their way of shaping the legal landscape, for the future.
So it was about more than just Terrell and his actions.
Exactly. It was about setting standards for the entire profession.
Okay, that makes sense. And it was a high-profile case. So I bet even back then, a one-year suspension for a lawyer would cause quite a stir.
Oh, for sure. We don't have, public opinion polls from back then. But it's safe to say that a suspension like that would have hurt Terrell's reputation and probably made it harder for him to get clients once he was allowed to practice again.
Yeah, a lawyer's reputation is everything. Even back then, word of mouth could make or break you. But it also makes you wonder, what if the court had gone all the way and disbarred him completely? How would that have changed his life?
Oh, that's a really thought-provoking question. In those days, losing your right to practice law, in the Philippines, I mean, would have been devastating, absolutely devastating.
I can imagine.
He might not have been able to find another job that was comparable. And socially, well, it definitely would have tarnished his standing in the community.
It's a stark reminder of how high the stakes were. Even back then, for someone in the legal profession, it makes you think about all the choices we make in life and how they can ripple outward in ways we don't always anticipate. Maybe Terrell thought he was just being a clever lawyer, finding loopholes for his client, but it obviously backfired in a big way.
Right. It just goes to show you what might seem like a good idea at the time can have consequences that you don't see coming. And it really highlights that tension that lawyers often face between serving their clients' interests and upholding the law. It's a delicate balance, for sure.
It is. It really is. Okay, let's go back to that section of the legal code you mentioned earlier, Section 21 of the Code of Civil Procedure. You said it was surprisingly easy to understand, even for non-lawyers.
It is. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Basically outlines the reasons why a lawyer in the Philippines could be removed or suspended.
Okay, so what kind of things does it say?
Well, it talks about things like deceit, malpractice, and of course that phrase we've been talking about, gross misconduct.
So they were spelling it out pretty clearly, even back then.
Absolutely. No room for interpretation. And what's interesting is that Section 21 also lists things like being convicted of a crime that involves moral turpitude, which, as we discussed, is a pretty serious thing, and even disobeying a court order.
So it's not just about how you treat your clients, but about your overall conduct as a legal professional.
Exactly. You have to be above reproach.
And I think that's something we can all learn from Terrell's story. Even though it happened over 100 years ago,
Right.
the expectations for lawyers have always been high, and Section 21 really shows us that.
It does.
But let's not forget the human side of all of this. We're not just talking about abstract legal concepts. We're talking about real people and the very real consequences of their actions.
That's so important to remember. That's what makes history come alive, doesn't it?
It does. We're getting a glimpse into Terrell's world, his struggles, his choices, and the impact those choices had. Even though he lived over a century ago, there's something about his story that feels so relatable.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Terrell's story reminds us that even in what seems like a distant past, people faced similar ethical dilemmas to what we face today.
It really does.
It speaks to the timeless nature of these questions about right and wrong, and about the consequences of our choices.
It certainly gives us a lot to think about. Like, what would we have done in Terrell's shoes?
Right. Would we have made different choices?
It's a question we all have to ask ourselves. And it's amazing how history can spark those kinds of introspective conversations.
It really is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore. In our final part, we'll dig even deeper into the implications of Terrell's case and what it can teach us about the legal profession today. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the curious case of Howard D. Terrell, the lawyer from the early 1900s Philippines who got tangled up in some ethical dilemmas. It really makes you think about the choices we make, right? And the responsibility that comes with certain professions. It sure does. Terrell's story, it's like this battle between ambition and ethics. And the law gets caught right in the middle. It's something we still see today, all the time.
We talked about how the court suspended him for a year, but it makes you wonder what factors determine how severe the punishment should be. Was a year enough? Should it have been more?
Oh, that's a tough question. There's no easy answer, even back then. It would have depended on a bunch of different things, like how bad the misconduct was, what his intentions were, did he cause any harm, did he have a prior record? All of those things would have mattered. And of course, what might have been seen as a harsh punishment back in 1903 might not seem so bad today.
Right. We always have to think about the historical context. Plus, we're only getting one side of the story here, from the court documents. We don't really know Terrell's motivations or what kind of pressures he might have been facing. It's a good reminder that there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Absolutely. We can't judge people from the past based solely on what we think is right today.
Yeah.
We can learn from them, though, analyze their choices, and use that knowledge to make better ethical decisions ourselves.
That's a great point. It's not about condemning the past. It's about using it to create a better future. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Howard Day Terrell's story, what's the one big takeaway you'd like our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is this. The law isn't just some set of rules carved in stone. It reflects our values as a society. And those values can change over time. Terrell's case shows us how important ethical conduct is, not just for lawyers, but for everyone. It reminds us that our choices matter, and that doing the right thing, even when it's tough, is crucial for a just and fair society.
That's beautifully put. It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in making sure justice is served. So, to our listeners, I encourage you to keep digging into these historical cases. They offer a fascinating glimpse into the past. You might be surprised how relevant they still are today. Who knows, maybe we'll uncover another hidden gem of a case soon and bring it to you right here on the Deep Dive. Until then, stay curious, keep exploring, and remember, history is full of surprises.